Hey everyone. So this is a lecture for week 2 of Intro GIS, and the purpose of today's lecture is just to give a general overview of everything from input to output in a GIS, so that you're thinking about all of the steps that are going to be involved from getting from something like this, a list of data, to something like this, an output map product. So we're going to focus on components of a GIS, and just a reminder, the purpose of this is just to think about GIS as not just a way to make maps or a way to see spatial data visually, but it's also a bunch of steps in terms of thinking about what data goes into a project, managing those data, thinking about the analysis steps, and then finally getting to the point of making a map and visualizing your data. So we're going to think about that sort of scope of different problems and different steps that go into that GIS analysis. So here are the different major steps in geographic information science. So we start with input data, we manage those data, we analyze those data, and then we have an output at the end often in the form of a map. So let's talk a little bit about each of those steps. So input data, there are two main types, two types of spatial data that are going to be available to you. One type is vector data, the other type is raster data. Oftentimes in GIS or in Esri language, so that's the maker of GIS software, we often refer to vector data as shape files, and we often refer to raster data as grids. So you may hear me, you may hear other folks talk about shape files. Those are typically vector data. You may hear folks talking about gridded data, and those are typically raster. All right, so a little bit more about what that means, vector data versus raster data. So vector data in this map of the globe is using countries of the world that are vectors, vector polygons in that case. So vector data come in three types. They can be points, they can be lines, connecting points, they can be polygons, which are based on an area defined by connecting a whole bunch of different points. All of those are built on things that we would call vertices. So those are points, right? A point is just a vertex, a line is connecting two vertices, and a polygon is connecting three or more vertices to form a shape. Regardless of whether you have points, lines, and polygons, all of those features have attributes. So you can open an attribute table of vector data. And for example, if I clicked on Australia, I could, depending on what the data source is, it might tell me the area of Australia, it might tell me the population, it might tell me the gross domestic product of Australia. Who knows? Lots of different information that could be associated with that particular polygon and would be found in an attribute table. The other main type of data is raster data. So raster data are continuous grids. They are often, a good example of that is an aerial photo like this one shown here. So images with a spatial context to them. Remotely sensed data, which are also often images of some sort, are almost always raster data. Topographic data are almost always raster data. So those continuous grids are made up of numeric pixels. So that is the smallest, it's a square, that is the unit of measure for raster data. And each of those pixels is going to have a number assigned to it. So raster data are numeric, and they don't really have any other attributes other than a number associated with each of those pixels. So for example, if I clicked on, this is a grayscale image, aerial photo with stuff from light to dark in it. If I clicked on a pixel that was this bright color, I should get a high value related to reflectance of light or brightness of this really white rooftop there. And if I clicked on this shadow down here, I should get a very low numeric value related to dark, essentially a much lower reflectance of light in that shadow. So where do we get these vector and raster data sets? Well, sources of spatial data can include websites. They can include data that other people have purchased or that you purchased. So for example, there are some really high resolution remotely sensed imagery that are for sale by private companies. There's a lot of freely available remotely sensed data too, including topographic data and aerial photos and other imagery. You can talk to faculty, graduate students, so use the UMass resources that are available to you to find sources that things that people have mapped. You can create your own, so you can go out and take some GPS points. You can go out, you can geo-reference some data. You can draw on a map, you know, like the features that you're interested in mapping. One source, so input source for data layers, spatial data layers here in Massachusetts that you should be aware of is MassGIS. So you can Google MassGIS, go to the data layers page on that website and find lots and lots of different spatial data layers, both vector and raster, lots of information at the town level, as well as at the county level, information about open spaces, lots of environmental stuff, lots of geologic stuff, lots of all kinds of stuff. So it's definitely a website to keep an eye on and check out, especially later on in the semester when we're thinking about final projects. All right, so that was all input. The next piece is a management piece. So vector data, typically in ArcMap or in ArcPro, if you open it in terms of trying to add data, or you look at the catalog window to the right of the screen in terms of adding data, you will see vector data, and they have these sort of like shapes, points, little dots on them to illustrate point data, a line of some sort to illustrate line data, and a polygon-y looking thing to illustrate polygon. So that's what they would look like whether you're in ArcMap Desktop or in ArcPro. In Windows, if we went to that same ice rinks file, so that point shape file, we would find a whole bunch of different data layers associated with it. And these data layers contain things like, you know, the location of the vertices, the georeferencing of that file, the attribute table, but they are not a single file. There are lots of different files. So just as a heads up, it's going to look different if you see the data in Windows versus if you see the data in ArcGIS. Raster data, similarly in ArcMap, have this sort of like bubbly effect kind of thing. So you can see which ones in here are raster data sets. If you're in Windows, raster data sets tend to be more complicated because they often have multiple, they often contain data in multiple folders. And that makes it particularly tricky to kind of extricate raster data using Windows. Much better to work, if you're going to copy and move things, much better to do that within the Arc catalog framework. What you need to know in terms of data management. One important piece is that any spatial data that you download or get from somebody else should always have, ideally, metadata associated with it. That is sort of our best data management practices, is to have metadata. And what are metadata? Metadata are essentially information about the data. So that can include information like who collected it, what is the purpose of this data set, when was it collected. It should also contain definitions and descriptions of each of the attribute columns. So if you're using vector data, what the values mean in each of the attribute columns. Or if you're using raster data, it should have information about what each of the numbers mean in your raster data set. Not all data necessarily have metadata. Sometimes not everyone is good about best practices in terms of data management. But ideally, anything that you find on a website that is published data, published along with a scientific paper, those should have metadata associated with it. And anything published out of UMass ideally should have metadata, because the UMass libraries have been really good about helping folks publish their data and making sure that they have all the information that anyone would need to understand where those data came from and what their purpose is. The other big thing to know right now about data management, and in this class, we don't do a lot of data management other than, keep an eye on where you're saving your data. Make sure that you've got folder structure set up for, saving lab 1, lab 2, lab 3, final project, etc. There is a lot more to data science and data management out there. So this is just a couple of really brief, like pointers of things to think about. So first is to know that metadata should exist. Second is to use ARC Catalog or the ARC Catalog window in ARC Pro anytime you're copying and pasting spatial data. So rather than moving in windows, it's always safer to copy paste something in ARC Catalog if you're trying to get it into a new location. That's particularly true with raster data that often have, especially ARC GIS grids, which can have data stored in multiple folders, and it's hard to extricate on your own without ARC GIS's help. All right, in terms of analysis, so in this class, we are going to be doing a lot of different types of analysis. Those are throughout the semester. So for example, starting this week, we're going to be talking about or working on querying, so selections of data layers. You're also going to be working on linking between different data layers. So this week, you're going to learn about joins. In Lab 7, you're going to learn about extracting information from one data set into another. We're going to do some suitability analyses. So some of that's coming up next week in Lab 3, some of it's coming up after spring break in Rasterland in Lab 6. And we're going to learn a little bit about statistical analyses and interpolation when we get to Lab 7. And just some examples of suitability analyses. One of them we've already talked about, but just in terms of thinking about, because this is one of the most intuitive, I think, analytical pieces of GIS. So we talked in class last week about Doggie Daycare suitability, right? So this was an example where the folks who made this map were looking for to combine information about attributes of different spatial layers that gave them information about customer suitability. So remember, that was stuff like, income and, like proximity, or sorry, that income was one of them, age was one of them, like whether they were working, if they were spending money on pets was another one of them. And then they combined that attribute information, so selections by attributes, with selections based on distance suitability, and that was based on distance to the central business district, distance to roads, sort of proximity to parks where you might be able to walk dogs and stuff like that, and then put all of that stuff together to get this output map of highly suitable locations to unsuitable locations, which is actually the majority of the map. Here's another example just to show you more maps of a suitability analysis. We're going to talk about this one more in a little bit in future weeks. This is one for the desert tortoise. So this area is Nevada and Southern California and the edge of Arizona and Utah. And essentially what this is a score from low to high of suitability of this landscape for desert tortoise habitat. So just like in the last one, we thought about suitability in terms of the customer base and how close we were to the customer base for setting up a doggy daycare center in Seattle. This one is thinking about what are the conditions of this landscape that are good for a tortoise. So those might include things like, is the soil appropriate for a tortoise to dig a burrow? Is there food available for the tortoise? Like whatever other environmental direct measures or proxies we could think of to put into this map. All right, and then the last piece is the output piece. So GIS output in the best case scenario is both information rich and intuitive or understandable. You can, and those are sort of two axes. You can be really intuitive with very little information. You can have no intuition with tons of information. And so the art form is sort of balancing those two pieces to the point where people can still understand your map, but there's a lot of cool information that they can dig into. So that gets us to the point of cartography. So cartography is known as both the art and science of map making. So the science is because there are some rules, which we're going to go over in terms of, things that lead to better or worse maps. The art piece is because there are a lot of cartographic choices. And as we go through labs this semester, you're probably going to hear me say that's a cartographic choice, which means that you as a map maker, it's up to you. There is not necessarily one best map to rule them all. There are lots of different maps that could, very effectively and intuitively convey information and convey a rich set of information. So the goals of cartography are to communicate geographical information graphically, right? So again, maximizing ideally both that information presented, so information rich, and maximizing your ease of understanding things, your intuition. Map design typically is made of are broken down into sort of three different things, which are referred to as harmony, composition, and clarity. I wouldn't worry too much about those specific words. I'm going to use them here because that's what map makers use, but generally, on the whole, these rules I think of as, harmony is thinking about color and texture. We'll get into composition and clarity in a second. So color and texture. So here's an example of a map where the folks who designed this map have labeled it as having bad harmony. So poor color choices. So I want you to look at that and maybe pause this video for a second and think about why we would label this as having poor color choices and what you might do to improve that. All right, so when I look at this map, I notice that the color scale on here is actually this rainbowy kind of scale. So it's sort of a rainbow with slightly weird magenta kind of thing and a really dark red at the edge. Rainbows, although, in our heads, there's sort of a clear transition from like red to orange to yellow and whatever comes at the end of a rainbow. On a map, they're less intuitive, right? So in this case, this is a map of state population going from really low population states to really high population states. Typically, if you're trying to build a map where you have numeric values from low to high, or any values from low to high, they don't have to be numeric. So if you have a gradient that goes from low to high, rather than choosing rainbow colors or choosing an array of different random hues, random colors, a better choice for that is to use graduated color, something that we call graduated color, which is one where you go from light red to dark red or light green to dark green, whatever the particular color is. That tends to be much more intuitive for your audience than a bunch of different colors. A bunch of different colors is good for, when you have a categorical, like these are all the states that have a bird mascot, and these are all the states that have some other animal, non-bird mascot or something like that, right? Then different colors can sort of group states categorically, because there's no progression, there's no like low to high when you're thinking about birds and non-birds as the state animal. So harmony, in terms of our color choices, you may have heard of color palettes like this one, red, green, blue, or a color palette that is cyan, magenta, yellow, and then often black. So CMYK is something, RGB, red, green, blue, CMYK, black is usually added on there. Another color sort of palette, I guess, a way of presenting color is something called HSV, which stands for hue, saturation, and value. And this is really nice for cartographers because it allows us to easily create a color palette that is different hues. So this would be one where if you chose one of each of these three colors, that would be good for differentiating like bird versus non-bird state animals. Whereas saturation and value are really good for creating those color gradients. So the graduated color, whether that goes from light to dark, or whether it goes from this, we'll call it vividness, but it's sort of like how much gray the color has. So more gray to less gray, more vivid. So HSV is a really nice slider. If you wanted to get into the level, which you don't have to do in this class, but the level of sort of creating your own color bars and stuff like that in GIS. One nice thing is that GIS already creates a bunch of color schemes that will give you sort of the same hue, for example, in graduated color, but different saturation or value. So you can see over here, this is an example of a graduated color scheme that you can find in the Symbology and ArcPro that goes from light to dark. So the same hue, the same red color, but a very light red here to a very dark red on that side. So that means that you don't have to be the one to create differences in value or manually do any of that. GIS has got you. They've done that for you. And then this is just an example of something that cartographers sometimes do with color, which is that on the left side, this is an example of a map where all of the different colors, so this is counties in the Midwest, and the different colors represent the minority group with the highest percentage population in each of those counties. So on the left, we have a constant value and saturation and different hues. So with different hues, but a constant value and saturation, you get this map that's fairly pleasing. You know, all of these look somewhat similar in terms of nothing really pops out at you. They're all just kind of like a flat, I would say, harmonious set of colors. On the right side, though, well, okay, so before we look at the right, look back at the left and notice that there are some of these that are more common, right? So Black or African American is fairly the more common minority group. Hispanic or Latino is a fairly common minority group, and American Indian or Alaskan Native, a fairly common minority group. The less common minority groups are Asian in the blue here, and the ones that are 2 or more races in the orange here. And so on the right side, what this map has done is to try to make those less common categories pop out just a little bit. So they have changed the value for Asian for these blue. That makes it a little bit darker blue. And they have made 2 or more races here a little bit more saturated, which makes it, I guess, a little bit more yellowy yellow. And the effect of that is that if you do this, if you just change the saturation or the value for some of your less common categories, they tend to visually pop out a little bit more, which if you want to emphasize the rare things that are happening in your map on kind of an equal footing to the more common things, that's a way to do it. You may not want to do that. Maybe really what you want to emphasize is the more common categories, and you're not worried about making the blues or the yellows pop. That's a cartographic choice. Depends on the purpose of your map. All right, point number 2 in cartography is composition. Composition relates to what you choose to put on your map. So one key rule that I have in terms of composition, so I guess I should take a step back. Here is an example of 1999 population, so state population, using a graduated color from light to dark. So this one, hopefully, should look a little bit more intuitive to you that this is low and this is high than the one that we looked at, a couple of minutes ago that was on those rainbow scales. One key thing for me in composition is to try to avoid excess white space, right? So if your map looks like this, maybe instead of a portrait view, you want to go to the other one, the long view, so that your map extends to the full extent of your page. If you've got a scale bar, tuck it down here. If you've got a legend, tuck it in here so that you don't have all of this like giant white space surrounding your map. Composition also deals with reducing complexity. So here is an example of a map that is information rich, right? There is a lot of information on this map, but in intuition, I have no idea what they're trying to show or what the purpose of this map is, right? So this has gone too far in complexity to lose the intuition. So think about the elements that you need to put on your map. What is the minimum number of elements you can include on your map that will get your point across? In map making, in cartography, oftentimes less is more when it comes to the actual elements that you choose to put on your map. The other thing in terms of composition is to reduce distractions. So I say this, I would frame that as, please do not decorate your results. This is not a map, but is a graph of fuel economy standards from 1978 to 1985, right? That's what you see in the middle, but that is not the first thing you see. When you look at this, you spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the heck these guys are doing there and what that means and stuff like that on this map. So it is often tempting, because cartography has an art component to it as well. It is tempting to add, other features or decorations or things onto any visual display, but be cautious about that, because less is often more in terms of what you actually display. You want people to be looking at your map, not looking at this guy. Last piece in map design is clarity. So this is this I would frame as intuition and ease of reading that map. One key thing to think about in terms of clarity is to choose intuitive color schemes. So that means that, and this is actually the same map twice. This is a bathymetry map. So that's essentially topography of the ocean basin, like how far down the ocean goes, of the Japan basin. So here's Japan. The right one is sort of standard color schemes, blue representing water, brown representing land, because we don't really care about the land too much. We want to emphasize the water. And then we have these sort of bathymetric topographic lines in here. The one on left is all kinds of crazy rainbow color schemes, right? So if you are making a map of water, blue, that's a good color for water, right? If you're making a map of forest, green, that tends to be an intuitive and a standard color for forest. And ArcGIS has a bunch of pre-existing symbols for various different land cover types. You can look through the gallery of different polygons. This is true for points and lines as well. So this works with vector data, not with raster data. The more you stick with, standard symbology that's been used in the past, the more likely you are to have people, quickly pick up, okay, I've seen this symbol before when I looked at a map. I've seen a tree before, that like picture of a tree. I get that this is going to be an area with trees in it. So don't reinvent the wheel when it comes to the patterns and the symbols that you use. Use things that are standard for cartography. Clarity also deals with how far in you zoom on your map, right? So remember, in the layout view, if you have a data frame in your layout view, like the edges of this, that's going to be the extent of your map. You can activate that to zoom in, zoom out, pan it around. But if your focus is on, Durham, North Carolina, then, just show this area, right? Or just this town. No need to have all this extra stuff around the outside. That only serves to distract from what you're trying to show. So zoom in as much as you can for your map product so that your data frame hugs the extent of the data that you want to show. And then the last thing to talk about in terms of clarity are font choices. So there are two main types of fonts. Well, three main types, because I've got three on here, but two more common ones. One is a serif font. And so this sentence is written in Times New Roman, which has a serif font. The second is a sans serif font, which this sentence is written in Arial, which is a sans serif font. So serifs are these little extra doohickeys attached to every letter, like a little decorative doohickey, right? Like a little bubble on your C and stuff like that. Sans means without in French. So without serifs, they are just straight lines and stuff like that. Anytime you're doing map display, so this goes for in your legend, in your scale bar, your north arrow, any text that you add to a map will always be more legible and easier for people to read if you use a sans serif font. And that's because, these are both the same size of font on the slide, but this one doesn't have those extra doohickeys for your eye to decipher, discern. It's just a little bit easier to read. The other plus of that is you can make this font much smaller size-wise and still have it legible. Whereas when you get really small in Times New Roman, too many doohickeys going on and harder to read. There's also a font there are different display fonts. So here's that same sentence written in one of these display fonts. Comic Sans is a display font, right? Display fonts are even harder to read generally. So use those with discretion. If you're going to use a display font or a fancy looking font, just bear in mind that the fancier, the weirder looking the font is, the bigger you're going to have to make your text size and the longer it's going to take people to see it, to read it, to understand it. So simpler is generally better as far as cartography goes. All right, so that's it for this week for the brief lecture. I will hopefully see you in lab. Thanks very much.